A two-day summit in Beijing, bringing together the leaders of China and 53 African nations, ended early this week with a declaration and an action plan being adopted. President Xi Jinping pledged that China will extend a staggering $60 billion of financing to Africa in an attempt to build a China-Africa community with a shared future. Most of the billions of dollars that China commits to Africa are repayable long-term loans. What are the implications for a continent already in a chokehold over loans and aid? Can this spur growth, or is this yet another debt trap hedged on Africa's mineral wealth? On the spotlight is a panel of three, including Professor Augustus Nwagaba, Mr. Bakr Mayanja, and Dr. Fred Muhumuza, who are all economists. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. The spotlight is on you tonight, and let me begin with you, Professor Augustus Nwagaba, who's seated close to me here. You are managing consultant at Reeve Consult International. I'm going to begin quoting a book written by, I think, Dambisa Moyo, in a book entitled Dead Aid. Dambisa Moyo makes a compelling case that despite Africa receiving around $300 billion since 1970 in aid, this aid hasn't sustained corruption, stifled the spirit of free enterprise. It has not helped to spark growth. Will this $60 billion from China do anything different for Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick, and good evening, viewers. I think one of the most serious things that have happened in Africa, and what, for me, I have argued against, is really this issue of aid. Because what aid has done since 1970s is to kill competitiveness, what we call free enterprise initiative. It has killed private motive incentive. And when you see and span the whole of the 54 now African countries, you hardly see the impact of aid in terms of economic growth, enterprise development, sustained growth and development. And what you normally see is money and the capital inflows coming in, but you do not realize what technology transfer, what human capital development, what business enterprise, what level of competitiveness this aid has created. And therefore, for me, I've argued consistently that instead of pursuing aid, instead of pursuing these monies from outside, instead of needing for people to give you money, you need to develop private motive incentive. You need to do business. You need to argue for creating space for doing business. And in this aid from President Xi Jinping, for me, what I really recognize as something important is even not the 60 billion quantum, but actually the 5 billion part of it, which is only a very small amount, and this money is for import financing. He's putting aside $5 billion for financing import trade. And for me, really, that's the only thing I see, because our major problem in Africa, our major problem in Uganda has really been lack of export performance. We have had a very, very poor performance of export sector performance. We have had a very poor balance of trade. We have had very unfavorable balance of trade. We have had very poor negative current account. We have had Uganda importing more in value than we are exporting, and therefore we have had very serious inventory of what you call balance of payments, which cannot be resolved by aid. Because what aid does is really to kill initiative, is to kill enterprise development, is to kill individual motive incentive, is to kill what would have been, let me summarize it as follows. It kills what usually we call in classical economic theory. Development should be initiated from within.
Okay, let me go to, because you laud the $5 billion that's supposed to facilitate trade.
Import trade.
And I remember the former US President Barack Obama, when he was in Johannesburg, South Africa, visiting Africa, and trying to engage with the young people of Africa. There was a conference call that was made right here from this studio by a former NTV employee here called Kachungira, Nancy Kachungira, who has now joined the BBC. And remember, Irene Komo, a Ugandan young lady, was telling Barack Obama that what we need is not actually aid, but trade with you. And it appears, Abu Bakr, that the leaders of Africa have not understood that the begging bowl we are moving with all respect is not the solution for Africa, but trade. How can we trade fairly and then create growth for Africa?
Oh, that's a good question, how we can trade. And it's good to get an understanding of the landscape because we're talking about Africa. And obviously Africa came to exist, you know, some people sat on a table and drew it up, the 54 countries, and we've been quite religious at keeping them all these years. Trade is about competitiveness. It's about the cost at which you produce your goods. And to some extent, the thesis on aid is correct. I mean, Einstein said only a fool does the same thing and expects a different result. So we've had aid for 50 years. There are some economies in Africa that have shown progress. What we can do, first of all, to trade is to first trade with each other. And to do that, people like, or institutions like Africa Development Bank have to get out of microfinance, and they finance cross-Africa infrastructure. Why wouldn't you be able to put your goods on a train in Johannesburg and they end up in Kampala? And that same train channel can be the fiber, and then that can also be the movement of people for tourism. We have to look inward for development, and however, it should also be understood that investment is important. These are the two channels of creating development.
So you're saying that trade should be intra-African trade?
Yeah, why would you expect to trade with somebody in the Samoa Islands if you're not trading with somebody in Kenya? So the question becomes...
So we should trade in our common property?
The question becomes, why aren't we doing it?
What is common amongst us, Mr. Mayanja?
What is common amongst us, if we're to be brutally honest, is war. And let me just draw the picture for you, just a minute. If you come down from South Africa, we've just had President Zuma leave. So that is a bit of a democracy. But you know all the hulabalu about that. Go to Zimbabwe, there's chaos there. As you might be aware, President Mugabe left at the tender age of 90. Then start coming up, you come to the East African community, you've got Kenya and Tanzania with democracy. And then there's some debate as to whether Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi is democratic because we've changed our constitutions. Then that spreads into DRC and South Sudan. South Sudan has had a war now for 4 years between two people. And after 4 years, they say they've signed an agreement, but so many people have died. So how do you trade in war? We lost 200 billion worth of exports. Go up to Cameroon. They are on the verge of a civil war. Go to Bamako, Mali. Go into Egypt, where President Sisi overthrew the elected president. Go to Somalia. We are at war, and guess who's trading? The guys producing the
American
guys producing the weapons. At least if we were to fight, let's fight with spears, because at least then we don't have to spend our hard money.
So it's the American military-industrial complex.
It doesn't. We don't have to say it's American
or Russian, whatever it is.
Because even China sells weapons. I didn't want to give you statistics of weapon sales, but the point I'm trying to make is, what is prevalent in Africa is war. Come down to home. What do we give DRC? What do we give South Sudan? Our presidents are, sorry, I don't want to say that. Our countries do not support each other in trade. We are always suspicious of each other. Uganda has fought 2 wars with Rwanda in DRC, in Eastern DRC. So when I look at the continent, what is prevalent is war, as opposed to economics.
Okay.
Yes.
We have just, Dr. Muhomoza, we have just concluded the China-Africa summit, where African leaders, with all respect, with their begging bowels, were promised a staggering $60 billion. You are an economist. If this money is put to greater use, could it spark growth?
Certainly it would. money should be able to facilitate growth, but it's not growth itself. Money is a means to an end. It's a medium of exchange, the basic definition of money. So as people have put on the table before, what do you have that money is going to facilitate? So you can easily bring in this money, and all you use it for is fight one another. Now, you don't blame the aid. You don't blame the one who gave you the money. You blame your own self for not having a plan to use that money for purposes that will give you the growth. So I think coming from the discussion that my colleagues have put on the table, the governance issues in Africa are more constraining, that no matter how much aid you put into Africa, no matter how much money you put onto the table, you're not going to go anywhere until you have resolved the governance issues in Africa. African leaders think they own the state. So when they want to buy a jet, they will buy it. If they want to host Mugabe, as he's talked about, if he wants a birthday of $20 million, he will do that. So because they think they fail to distinguish between the state resources, state objectives, and their personal initiatives. So now, you don't blame aid and the one who gave it to you. Angola is one of the most indebted countries when you talk about China. Angola sells oil. Now, I see so many Ugandans who are like, we're about to sell oil, or our problems will be gone. I'm like, look at Gabon, look at Angola, look at Nigeria. They have been selling oil for years.
Or even Venezuela.
And Venezuela.
Even in more quantities than India.
It's not about the money, it's about how are you structured. Look at Norway. They sell oil like every other person, but Norway is on a different plane compared to all these other oil selling countries. Look at our Middle East friends. Look at Libya. And people are just saying, because Libya was destroyed by these other foreigners, let's come back, sort out our governance issues, put our agenda on the table. What is it that we want to do? Now, you don't build a dam and the whole deal is in the procurement of the dam. Nobody is bothered. I see people say, you want to send us back in the days of when we got darkness. In Uganda, we got darkness in the early 2000s. It's not because we do not have power. We had just made a mistake of putting a second dam next to the other one, which was a corruption issue. So you don't blame the issue on necessarily saying because we didn't have enough power. It was a corruption issue of placing that dam next to the other one, but people want to refer to that as a scarecrow. So now let's ramp up our dams. We now are going to have excess megawatts, 1,000 of them. We are paying. And you want to blame the Chinese for that? So they can even give us 6,000 billions. Africa will not move until we resolve our governance issues.
You know, now talking about the resources of Africa, China gives the loans with high interest rates, but it appears these resources are also paged on a country, specific country resource. Are African countries not really headed to what I'm told has been the case for Venezuela, whereby before you know it, you have mortgaged your oil, and all the Venezuelans now are running across Colombia and wherever, getting out of the country. About 2 million Venezuelans have left, yet they have the second biggest resource, the largest.
Soon they will solve the problem because everybody would have left.
Exactly. I think what we need to warn governments, and I want to repeat it here, is this issue of front loading. Front loading is even being done, I think, in most of these countries, including Uganda. And I think we have warned the government here that if you peg, for example, now oil on which is prospective, it is not yet on top of the ground, but it is prospective, and you are front loading it against a number of things that you need to do. Now, what happens in that case, and what has happened before, like people have been mentioning Equatorial Guinea, have been mentioning Gabon, have been mentioning Angola, Nigeria, is that Ghana is actually the best example of front loading, is that it creates over-exaggerated expectations. And what happens is that it creates what is called resource movement effect. Even like in Uganda's case, even people who are doing very lucrative agriculture in Kasese for maize, beans, and they are getting a lot of money, groundnuts, they are going to say, no, we have oil, and I'm going to sit on my door, and the government is going to move distributing money to me. So, let me repeat it. It is unfortunate to have exaggerated expectations of a resource like oil, and then start front-loading investments, especially public investments, especially of long-term nature, and their returns are not very quick. Their multiplier effects are very narrow, In other words, their, in the English language, their attraction to very many other things which did not get attached to that investment before are very minimal. And so, what do we need to do is that you need to be transparent. All these countries which have succeeded have been transparent. I think Freddie Mohammed has already mentioned Norway. The thing that Norway does, which other countries don't do, particularly that have these extractive resources, actually it is called publish what you earn, publish what you spend. And this is where Norway beats everybody else. And so what are we proposing is that we need to be very careful on these loans. We have been given, as you have already said, $60 billion. This is quite a substantial amount of money, but it's not as substantial as the money that Africa has received before. Because Africa has received quite significant amount
about
of money, $300 billion
in the last 4 years.
About 5 times this money which is being given to these 54 African countries. But if you consider the money which South Korea has got from 1954 to about 1980s, and South Korea has been able to do 2 things. One, which I want to emphasize and be very emphatic about, is that South Korea has been able to repay all of this money that it got from loans. 2, South Korea has been able to transform its economy. It is one of the best countries now that you want, which is one of the major donors here. So the main issue was transparency, integrity, and of course governance, as people have been saying here. And so what we needed to do really is that the benchmark is I don't know whether we can use the word transparency because this is a tired word now. Whether we use it, integrity is a tired word now. Corruption is a very, very tired word as well. But what we need to do is really to have transformative approaches in doing things. Transformative approaches and approaches which are new in dealing with things of national importance, such that you don't have a resource, just something like oil, and it ends up creating a Dutch disease. It ends up creating...
Okay, Professor, many African states were at the same level with their Asian tigers economies in the 60s, and you're giving the case of South Korea, and so was Singapore and I think Malaysia. But now they seem to have transformed their economies at a faster rate. Abu Bakr, what is missing for Africa? What has been missing in Africa? I know you have started an issue of war.
No, let me try and put things in perspective a bit. I don't know whether to start in Uganda or to start in Europe. You take a pick, Patrick. You're always good at guiding.
Uganda?
Yes, when I was in school, there used to be a very famous book called Taewa. Because we're tackling a very complex subject. Because you are trying to ask us, we're getting 60 billion from China. Is it good or bad? So the joke is, there are 200 economists that tell you on the one hand and on the other. So this famous book, or Taewa, used to be a pamphlet. And every question they ask, it used to start on the one hand and on the other. So I can picture the finance minister calling his team now, because those are the graduates of Professor Taewa, who probably...
I remember the pamphlet.
And he says, okay, is it good to have mobile money tax or not? They say, on the one hand is good, and on the other it's bad. I hope Professor Nwagawa is not following that culture. But let's put things in perspective. The first continent to grow in this world was Europe, because of its diversity. And that's why it ended up colonizing from the US to Australia. What caused the collapse was they started, wealth was centralized in a few hands. And so the masses started agitating. And then Europe went to war. When it went to war, then the empire started collapsing. So it started collapsing from the side of the US. So that's where prosperity was first created, then destroyed in 2 world wars. Then enter China, the question you are talking about. WTO 1994 China opening up policy, Deng Xiaoping. China was bringing 1 billion people into the labor market. And also, they became the manufacturing shop of the world. So obviously a lot of wealth was created there. They bypassed Singapore. Sorry, they bypassed Korea, Professor, and then they bypassed Japan. Now, come down right now to Africa, where are we in this whole equation? Why is it that now Africa is of interest? Is because China has changed its stance. It's going a little bit higher from low value manufacturing to now they are starting to respect intellectual property. But they have a problem of feeding 1 billion people. Europe has declined again because the Euro experiment didn't work. Maybe later, if we have time, I'll go into the details of that. So what we are faced with now is a situation where even the US has gone into decline, and Africa is potentially the second largest economy in the world. The largest economy in the world by a big margin is the United States, 24% of the global GDP. And then China follows with 15% of the global GDP, for you to put things in perspective. Then you have a few European nations coming in. So when I look at the global GDP, if you get the entire African continent, it doesn't even raise the bar. But here's the contradiction. Africa, as I normally joke, is the world's poorest continent and the world's richest continent. So right now, if we start waking up, we will bring 1.2 billion people into the market, labor market. And so definitely we can grow much faster than China grew because of that. So we have to harness human capital, right? That means that the budget for education and skills and vocational should be a little bit higher than the budget for weapons and security. So it sounds like a job, but then, and also, please, before I finish, then natural resources. The nature, the capital nature gives you. Africa has all the minerals in the world. So do you see that when you combine those two, this is why you're seeing a lot of interest. May is here. The Indian president was here. You're seeing the German, Angela Merkel, and China, because everybody realizes now in Europe and America, they have to pay pensions of the baby boomers. So do you realize that right now Africa is the attraction in the world? But the risk is if we borrow money in dollars, it creates a risk because Sri Lanka lost a port to China. So there are some risks that Professor Nwaga was able to illuminate, and maybe later we can go into the technicalities of that. I hope that...
Dr. Fred Muhomes, I think Bakr has raised the question of human capital development, because if Korea has developed and maybe Singapore, because they have a skilled population that can not even relying on anything like minerals and what, but on their human capacity. So what do we need to do? Because yes, we have 1.2 billion people in Africa, but they are skilled. They are not as skilled. They're not ready to get into the job market, even though you're saying we're bringing 1.2 people in a job market. Really, they're not going to get there because they are not prepared.
It's a question of strategy, and it's not necessarily true that Africans are not skilled. They are skilled for their task. If all you have to do is to swim across a river to go to school, your skill that you need is swimming across this crocodile-infested river. and they have survived. Before you need is the monkeys, chase your monkeys off your garden. They make scarecrows to protect their gardens. So their skill is to the task. Now, until our leaders begin to say, what do we see as the future path of Africa's growth? And therefore, what skills do we need? Otherwise, you will end up training here rocket scientists when actually your problem is dealing with cattle ticks.
So I can see you telling us things like Kira and Eve are not our
exactly, those are not your things. So what are you doing? What are you doing with those things? You already. I have met so many people.
You're actually dampening the spirit of the Ugandan innovator with his Kira motor operation.
I have met very many Ugandans who have lost herds of cattle to ticks. So that begins to say, if I am a cattle country and I really want to graze cows, what skills should I be developing? You want to go to your faculty of veterinary medicine, train veterinary doctors, train people at diploma level to deal with that problem. And because that's your strategy for development. We are an agricultural country. Then you are going to have basic diseases. So you want to skill up your people. The Chubans who are well skilled in medicine are not going to be doing heart surgeries. But theirs is community medicine. So without having that agenda of what is our strategy, we don't even know what skills to give. So every time I hear skilling Ugandans, I'm like, in what? Little wonder they come out of these vocational schools. And all they end up is washing cars. Maybe you should have skilled them in washing cars, making baskets, making nice mats, because that's at the level where you are. So I think our things are disjointed. We are here, you want to do a standard gauge railway. And I'm glad what is coming out of China. For the first time, Jinping says, I'm not going to do vanity projects in Africa. Because he's already being blamed for burdening Africa with debts. He received all the demands of investment that Africa presented. I want roads, I want flyovers, I want this, and he funded them. 10 years of over-investing in Africa, the continent has not moved. Now, he also has a problem to resolve. How do I recover my money that I lent to these countries, which lied to me that once infrastructure is resolved, we will become competitive, we will pay you back. They are not competitive. So now, the whole question of the standard gauge railway, Mombasa to Kampala and I don't know to where, the Chinese are actually raising more questions than the Ugandans because they don't want to be blamed for funding another vanity project, give Uganda, I don't know, 11 billion, and it's doing nothing. Chinese have an obligation to the Chinese people, but also to the outside world. Now, this is going to save us. That China is no longer the China we used to see, where Uganda say, I want an express highway to Entebbe. There are no vehicles. The problem in Entebbe jam ends in Kajansi, because it was about people trying to get to their homes, not getting to the airport. So you should have done another 15 roads feeding into people's homes so that not everybody is on that same small road. Now the express highway has become a den of thieves. So China is going to be asking the right questions. So before you
actually, Kisumu, Eldoret, I'm told Mombasa has more traffic airport than Entebbe, which is
so those are the questions. You need your airport strategy. So when you're talking about the Koreans, they knew we have no raw materials. So they did not skill in mining. They skilled in high-tech things because that was going to be their skill. Even the China we are talking about today has had a 40-year span of development. These developments in China we see began 1978 with Deng Xiaoping. And they skilled their people in outside countries. They sent people to the US, they sent people to Europe to train in particular skills. Now they are reaping that investment. Now in Uganda, how many oncologists do you have? How many gynecologists do you have? The other do we even failed to absorb medical doctors?
Okay,
that's the confusion.
Let me, because at least Professor Augustus, you began, you highlighted something positive, the $5 billion that's supposed to facilitate growth trade. And you think maybe that's a good thing. Could you please explain how that maybe it can even be improved here? And because the other time we had the AGOA project that was supposed to give us an opportunity to sell our garments into the American market, but again, and now, but we never got any benefits, dividends from that. And now you think $5 billion for the entire continent it will be a good thing. How is that?
Because thank you very much, and our viewers. What the 60 billion, which President Jinping is proposing, is cut into 4 major parts. One is the 15 billion, which are concessional, interest-free. The one is going to be interest-free, but actually they are concessional, long-term loans. There's something like 10 billion on the lines of credit. Then there's 5 billion, which is to facilitate import trade. And this is where, I think this is where, for me, I think there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And it facilitates, this money is supposed to facilitate export sector performance. In the same way, we had AGOA, which was African Growth Opportunity Act. And this was to facilitate African countries to export into the American market. And also we had EBA, which was everything but arms. This was also an act trying to an initiative.
Yeah, but what did we get from those vehicles?
That's what I'm coming to. But what happened is that most African countries squandered these initiatives. For AGOA, the only country which has done something, I think it is Swaziland. And Mauritius. And also a bit of Mauritius. And these countries have actually used these markets. For us, of course, we had problems with these textiles. And these, for EBA, we have had serious problems of I think 2 major problems. One is the problem of standards, and then 2 is actually the problem of quantity, production, the real production. And we wanted meat. There was meat market in Europe. Then in America there was textiles, and all these markets we did not take advantage of. And of course the problem was the production cycle here is that what actually here carries the market here is actually 2 major things. One, we are small holder. It is very difficult if you say, even if Sheraton said or Serena said, I want every week supply me honey. You know, it is very difficult for you to move around and get actually the honey which Serena can absorb in a week. This is our major problem here. And of course, too, is standards. Because these are markets that are they use very high standards. And so what I can see is that we need to be very careful, we need to be highly innovative, we need to be very highly enthusiastic in terms of changing the way we do things. And the way we lost this AGOA market and EBA, I don't see much difference, I don't see much change that has happened that is going to send a signal that this is $5 billion, however small it is, but can really cause a difference. What you need is to ensure that you can compete in the market that is available. And of course, as people here have said, you even don't need to have this kind of international market. We have had here regional market. Kenya needs maize. South Sudan needs maize and other grain. But of course, we have had a war in South Sudan. This was about $700 million, which was a very good market for us. And it really was very good for our current account, our balance of trade. But we lost it because of war. Even we have very many businessmen here in Uganda. We are really still suffering because of this. So what we need to do here is that we need to strengthen this within the inter-regional trade, within the East African community, for example. We don't even need to move very fast. So create peace for trade, create environment for trade, create an environment that is peaceful for trade, and this is what also Xi Jinping promised in his 8 points.
You're talking about trade, Bakr, you're talking about trade, and you began by telling us the 1.2 billion African population which is coming into the job market. But we have issues of standard and issues of volume. What do we need to do so that we can have the right standard and the volumes that are required? Because the other day, the Uganda Bureau of Standards said 56% of the products on the Ugandan shelves are actually counterfeit or fake.
That's
including the things we import and the ones that we make ourselves.
And then you expect somebody to come and buy from you.
Buy from you now.
When you have already declared yourself that you deal with fake.
The issue of standards depends on how much we really want to develop. But judging from how development happens in terms of the quality and the volume you're talking about, it's always about the production function, which is a combination of the knowledge of how to do something, the capital you employ, and the labor. Now, the theories out there is that when you have FDI, for example, if a European company that already knows the standards invests in a Ugandan company, then you get the standard. So you have to encourage mergers, acquisitions, and collaboration between developed companies, so you nurture the private sector to learn from others. In terms of volume, it's a question of deepening the financial sector so that if a company has the potential, they can access capital. And that can resolve the problem of standards. And then of course...
So eventually, Dr. Muhumuza, we may find that European companies or Chinese companies will come here, create a merger, maybe they have 6 or 80% ownership, and before we know it, the money that comes to Uganda still just bounces back to China or to European capital because...
I think that's exactly what is going to happen with the $5 billion of trade, because trade is two-way. So it's likely to promote more of Chinese products into Africa because we have nothing to sell on the other side. So that $5 billion is going to promote Chinese companies to do trade with us, and that's all I can see.
Gentlemen, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's dig deep into this issue. And later in the show, I'll be opening the lines so that you too also can be a part of this discussion. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching On The Spot. My name is Patrick Amara, and my guests tonight are Professor Augustus Nwagaba, Mr. Bakr Mayanja, and Dr. Fred Muhumuza, and we're discussing the Africa-China relation, where China has given Africa a staggering $60 billion, most of it in loans. But let me come to you, Mr. Bakr Mayanja. Some of the infrastructure projects which China funds are required that their own firms should undertake them. For instance, when China provides Africa assistance of $1 billion US, it will get service contracts worth $1 billion from Africa.
This is a tragedy, and you have to understand, and we all have to understand that as Africans, we have to take more responsibility for our own growth and development and develop our capital markets. I'll tell you, China has a big problem. they have to feed 1.4 billion people now. So right now, they need some of them to get out. So they try, I'm told, but these are things we hear, that if they bring a project, they'll make sure that those people stay there until when they are residents. The contract will go on for 10 years. These are their own strategic interests because they brought the money because you didn't have it. And you know, another thing that causes challenges is that in democracies, there's accountability, but when you have some weak states in Africa and say the leaders become dominant, the Chinese do not like to involve themselves in political matters and what, but they are very astute business people. That's why they became the second largest economy. In other words, as a people, they are very enterprising and very objective. So if they come to Africa with a big project, yes, they will build the road. But if you don't supervise them well, they have their own interests. They'll bring their own people because there are just too many where they are. And so that brings you back to the key strategic things, that it's not just China. Every other country that comes to you has their own interests. So as Africa, how do you deal with this? And so we have to develop the capacity to negotiate better. And you can only negotiate better from a position of strength. So instead of fighting each other and arguing with each other, yes, it's good when China comes, but you need to negotiate well so that at least if they bring some people here, you also make sure that at least give them 3 years, such that our people can learn the skills and then, yes.
We can hear of a staggering $60 billion, Dr. Fred Muhumuza, but are we able to tell how much China is making off Africa in terms of the trade they're having with us? You know, even when we sell them the raw material, of course, they go and add value, and most of it, or some of it, is sold here in Africa. I suppose they are getting much more from the 60 billion, from what, if you compare what they're giving us.
Of course, nobody will just give. China is not a donor country, it's a business country. So wherever they put their money, they have to get their money back. Jack Ma, who is one of the richest guys, if not the richest guy in China, said, every time I make a decision, I'm looking at an expenditure and income. I don't spend money where I'm not going to get an income. So if I send out 10, I must get something bigger than what I sent out. So they are looking at that to say, let's engage in Africa. But things are changing. People have failed to take note of the developments, global development in the last 10 years, since we had the financial crisis in the US, that people thought would be resolved in 2 years. Up to today, the world is still grappling. Before that time, China was growing at 14%. Today, China has said the new normal of growth is 6 to 7%. Now that means there is a whole lot of Chinese investments that they have put on hold. So their appetite for African natural resources has also reduced, because they were not just producing for themselves, they were producing for that global market, which is no longer there as we know it. So gone are the days where you would think Chinese are going to come here because I have gold, because I have minerals, or oil, because I have this. Those days are gone. Now they have to recalibrate, and something has got to give way. So they have invested already in heavy infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, and power in Africa. And as we have said, Africa has not moved, because that was not in the first place Africa's binding problem. Because in economics they will say there is a binding problem and there is a problem. There's a problem that binds you that you can't make way until you resolve it. But there are other problems you can limp with and move on. So infrastructure was a problem, but not the binding one. Now we have fixed it. Our binding problem was the governance and the administration structures of our continent. And we have failed to make money. Now China has to recalibrate. As you said, Africa is full of wars. Countries in wars invest more in war than development. So they also have to rethink, how am I going to get my billions that I've already put into Africa? So the 60 billion that has been promised is not available for whosoever flies into China to come back with it.
So wait a minute here. Dr. Fred Muhumuza is saying that if African leaders looked into their governance structure and see how they're governing their countries really, it would work for them better than go to Beijing and look for this $60 billion. Because if we can have some kind of efficiency and be frugal and be ethical, perhaps we can start from there in a better way.
Yeah, that's already, even before as he comes in, already Uganda and Kenya are failing to convince China to finance the standard gauge railway. It's not that China doesn't have the money, but China is already thinking, I've done the Nairobi Mombasa pass. I've done Mombasa to Naivasha. It's not making money. So why should I continue from Naivasha to Kisumu, Kisumu to Maraba, Maraba to Kampala? They are rethinking those kinds of things. So the 60 billion is available, but you must convince Chinese that actually there is a business case. If there is no business, that 60 billion is not going to be spent and would rather be there. It's an offer, but it's not a giveaway that whosoever wants come with a basket. So it's no longer begging balls.
Before Bakar, before you, Dr. Augustus, I just want to look into the issue of governance and how that alone perhaps can stop us from getting the development we need.
Yeah, I think
poor governance.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is obvious, because if you look at the development pathway that we have in Africa, you have countries like Botswana, you have Ghana. These are countries that with the exception of Ghana, of course, which has done a lot of front loading. But if you look at Botswana, that has a positive balance of payments, which has consistently had very good capital inflows as a result of very high performance domestically, and also having surpluses. What is the bottom line for some of these countries? We have Mauritius, you have Botswana, you have a little bit of Ghana now. And what is the bottom line of these countries? Of course, these countries are peaceful. They have been on quite a peaceful path. And this has created a pathway now for doing business. Because if I want to invest money, if somebody wants to invest money, you cannot invest money in an environment of no return if you make your projections. So business is done, you cast every
look at the risk profile
in the market. Yeah, every risk is cast in the market. So the businessman is looking, or woman is looking at, can I make what return in this environment? So I really urge African countries to ensure that if you want to do business, if you want to partake of some of this in a situation in which you are going to trade, not to continue going with the bag begging, is really to work on the issue of security, the issue of resolving conflicts, the issue of tolerance, the issue of governance, the issue of creating an environment in which we can all be able to do business and project and make sure that we can be peaceful in an environment in which people can make projections. Now, China, of course, people are going to say, but China is not a democratic country. What democratic credentials does China have to be able to dictate on some of these countries in this process? Let me repeat this, and I'm going to risk, at the risk of being misquoted, is that you need to find there are different approaches in which you can resolve really your governance questions. And of course, countries that have transformed very fast have transformed their economies on platforms that are able to resolve their conflicts and create a peaceful long-term horizon. And China is one of them. The moment they joined WTO, and they are now the second largest economy, they are the first country in the world that takes almost the largest say in WTO in taking goods to World Trade Organization. And America now, they engage in a very serious trade war, is of course that China has been able to resolve most of these conflicts. It creates an environment in which people can project and do business. Okay, and that's what I want most of these African countries to do. Because if you have South Sudan, where we are having $700 million in 2011, and by 2012, we are getting zero from this. How are you going to now balance your trade? It is a very, very serious problem which we have to resolve.
Bakar, in your view, do you think this country has increased its risk profile, especially when you look at the last 2-3 weeks, tumultuous times for Uganda, violence on the streets, sometimes people have been killed and blood and mayhem and stuff like that. So can people make their final investment decision amidst what you've seen? And then, especially now that we are all looking at the $20 billion that's supposed to come into the Albertine Graben.
Right, and it's good you ended with Albertine Graben. And we have to understand that we are playing in the world, and everybody has to look after their interests. The worst thing that can happen when your natural capital is discovered and you are a weak state is that you end up in turmoil. And so when you start to see headlines for 3 weeks that are negative, which, you know, give a negative outlook on the country, it means you reduce your bargaining power in the international markets. And also that means the bigger risk is that there will be interests there that are looking at your resources, and if you're disorganized, then they can take them. So I wanted to illuminate something on the standard gauge railway that is so important, because I remember I explained to you that see, Adam Smith, one of the greatest economists, said that the reason why transportation and logistics is so important is, first of all, you take the raw material, then you bring back the manufactured goods. So his contention was that if you don't have a working transport and logistics sector, then you don't have an economy. But here's the dilemma for Africa. You know, the rails we have were built by people who are extracting resources in the colonial times. That's what we've kept, and that's what we're trying to repair. That's the point I made when I was starting. In fact, you could be better advised if you get all that money and build the rail that connects the entire Africa, such that you can put your maize on a train here and it ends up in Cairo, and that same truck will take tourists within Africa. Don't even tour. So if we're to be serious about this topic, the governance issue, the challenge that you need to understand why China transformed in 30 years is because it's one country with one government. Africa has 54 countries. Let's come down to Uganda. We have 112 districts, each with a governor, and then the district has councillors, and then you have 400 MPs. That money is going out and is not going into production. Now, cascade that to 54. So our desire, look at the United States of America, one big country, one government. So there's efficiency, and that the money goes into production and investment into the production capacity. When you go to Europe, Europe failed to unite. They thought they would unite with the currency, but that experiment has failed. And I somewhat see Africa trying to go into monetary unions, but without a political or federal union, it's been proved not to work. So what can unite us as a continent is economics and technology. And these are the areas that I think, and technology seems to be giving most promise, because you don't put in a lot, and if you are able to connect Africans logistically, if you have a railway where, Patrick, you can wake up now, go to the railway station and get out in Bamako, it's the same way our crafts will end up in Bamako, and that same rail is where you put the fiber. And for me, this is the idea that makes sense for the concentration of that capital, so that then we don't need to sell our maize to whoever we need to sell it to, because there are resources here. Africa is rich enough, in my view, and therefore we need to harness technology and also sort out our transport.
We have a country in our, on the western side, which are our neighbor, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the size of Western Europe, one country, maybe one government, but they have failed to have some efficiency or even build the rails. In fact, I think they have more, I've seen more airports because I've flown in the Congo from Bunia to Kisangani and other places, and Goma. But when you talk about roads, non-existent. One country, one people, and huge enough, size of Western Europe. But
maybe it's not one country.
Before you leave that point, I was telling you something very important.
A scenario that if you are one country, perhaps you have one government, it can create some kind of efficiency because the decisions are made better.
But that's what he said. These one countries were holding one country were crafted by the Europeans.
That can have efficiency
through what was known as a partition.
But here's a most important point because of international relations. You know, empires have risen and fallen. Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire is very interesting because it has an Africa story. One emperor decamped and liked a certain lady in Egypt, and the one who came to look for him and also liked the same lady. But jokes aside, international relations are important. Look at what is happening in the world right now, that the global legal environment has broken down. Russia went and took part of Crimea. Then there are wars, proxy wars in Syria, Yemen. And so the world order as we knew it, that people had discipline to restrain themselves, is not there. And so for Africa to think that, it's so myopic to think that one country in Africa can defend itself. So you have to look at it from that perspective. So let me talk about DRC. DRC is the richest country in the world potentially. But have you heard that Amin took gold from DRC? Have you heard that story? Have you heard some other stories? So we the neighbors, we don't go and say, okay, our neighbors, let us grow with you. No, we go and rob them. So, but who are we robbing on whose behalf? So I want you to understand that the global dynamics have changed from USA being the superpower, and now there are fears that China is coming, and that creates competition. And China is a very quiet country. It is not going to go out there and make noise. And some of these European countries, somewhat the reason why some people like them is sometimes when you're having internal problems, they can give their voice. So do you understand that in Africa we have failed to help each other out? So look at DRC, it's our neighbor, it's the richest continent. If we manage to connect our rail up to Chisangani, for example, or Lubumbashi, do you know how rich we would be? A geologist friend of mine told me that it's a geographic catastrophe, that the moment you do like this, there's a mineral everywhere. But what do we export there? War. How many fighting groups are there? Who sponsors them? So how friendly are we to our rich, potentially rich countries? So do you realize that we need to look at ourselves more?
Recently I was in Zambia, and there's a map of Congo that enters in Zambia like a foot if you look at the Congolese map. So I was asking, how can this be Zambia? I mean Congo, and yet it looks like inside Zambia. And the Zambian told me that because that's the only part of Zambia that has gold. So when the guys were coming out,
they said let's get this one as well.
Yes, but Dr. Fred Muhammad, I understand the current Malaysian Prime Minister, when he was elected, he went and counseled. I think they had gotten some money or loan from China, of about $30 billion. And this is a country, I don't know how many, but it should be maybe the size of Uganda or less in terms of population. $30 billion for one country called Malaysia. Look at all our 53 heads of state, $60 billion. Yes. For them, they're ready to get it. $30 billion money is only cancelling it out. You can imagine that 1.3.
He didn't. He actually, as I said earlier, he didn't just cancel the 30 billion. He looked at what was the 30 billion going to do. That president who came in after that man had built up things was literally stealing. And that's why he kicked him out. So when he came, he found one of the major things was the crazy things Uganda is trying to do. A standard gauge railway between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. That journey by road is 5 hours. So people wanted to cut it to 1 hour, 80 minutes by putting a standard gauge railway. And he came and said, what transactions are going on along here to warrant such a huge $12 billion investment. And there was nothing. So by cancelling the project, the dollars began to be slashed. So he didn't even deal with the dollars. He went to say what are the investments we're trying to do. So similarly, if you want to invest in Uganda, and even now with our $32 trillion budget that we have.
$1
trillion. You want to look at it and say, what are we financing? Of course, 12 of this is debt management. Either we are rescheduling or paying interest. And we are already locked up in that, so that's not for debate. So you want to come back and say, what did we budget to do? If you move from that perspective, you will realize Uganda doesn't need that much money. Because a lot of projects we are doing are vanity projects. And China is coming straight. Now we want to do here a VIIP road to connect into Nakasero from the northern bypass. Sure. Is that really the need? Why don't we do so many other roads, including some railways? There are very many poor Ugandans who are walking to work. If you literally put a small rail to come from Kawempe to Kampala, to go to Bweyogerere, to go to Nsangi, you can move millions of Ugandans. And that can easily be one self-financing, but it will also help to ease the burden on these working Ugandans. Now you are going to put a special express road. So you need to revisit that. And I think that's what Malaysia is doing right. To say every investment I make must be justified on a business case. We don't have that in Uganda. We dream of something, we do it. We are starting an airline. I was like, maybe we should have revived Uganda Transport Company. Because that was going to touch people better than the airline you are going to put up there. So weird kind of thinking, thoughts and dreams that become policies, and we begin to throw money after them. The good thing for me is we are now going to be saved by those we thought were going to throw money to us. Aid is killing us, and the people giving us aid are beginning to sober up, to say, wait a minute, it's not just about giving you money. Justify why we need this money. And for me, that's a very good thing that is happening in the current century.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll be opening the line so that you two can be a part of this discussion, but I'll also be asking Professor Nwagaba whether Africa is not risking to be used as a pawn in the political game by the Chinese and the Americans in whatever interest they could be having. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching On the Spot. My name is Patrick Amara. My guests tonight are Professor Augustus Nwagaba, Dr. Fred Muhumuza, and Mr. Abubakar Mayanja. Before we went to break, Professor Nwagaba, I wanted to ask on whether Africa is not taking a risk to be used as a pawn in the political game between the Chinese and the Americans, and all these superpowers, because they are not doing charity, are they?
No. Yeah, because, thank you, viewers, because there's nothing like a free lift. There's nobody here giving a free lift. And you cannot, let me say this emphatically, you cannot live on the savings of another person. No individual can ever live permanently on the savings of others. So these I mean, the money the Chinese are promising cannot be free. It is not free. What has happened, I think, in the international politics of debt, of foreign debt, is that initially we were going to Paris Club, you remember, in the 1980s, 90s, you get money from government to government. And you see the Paris Club, here the Minister of Finance, and it goes, and then you are promised this amount of money. That went on until now. There was a problem, and we had to go into this HIPC, highly indebted poor countries, which we had debt cancellation, and all those were there. This was politics, which was unilateralism, when you still had unilateralism. And now, what has happened is that space has been shrinking. So it is not possible now to freely go to Paris and be able to get these monies. So what has happened, that there's a London club, these are money lenders, where countries like Ghana have gone there, Zambia has gone, and they have borrowed money. And these are real individuals, these are vultures, just individuals you borrow, and you are going to pay very, very high interest rates. And what has happened with the Chinese now is this is very serious, of course, international politics. China has come in to feel like that gap of where the sources of these monies has been shrinking. And China has come and say, and I hear even statements like, what Xi Jinping was saying, he said three things. When we give, we want to give and take less. We want to give and no return. And we want to give you so that we have a shared future. That's what he's saying. And when you look at it, as against now the real $60 billion, is that you may not, you may want to be very careful with it, because the $15 billion is actually a concessional loan. It is money that you're going to pay interest rate. And of course, African countries need to be very careful here, because we already have very high indebtedness. In Uganda, we have 38.6% of the GDP is debt. And if you continue with the standard gauge, you continue with the pipeline, which are very good projects in an environment in which we had a business. We are taking our maize, you are going to Mombasa, you are shipping maize to South Sudan and so on, and you're going to get returns. But the problem with these monies, especially this kind of money, is that it has lacked what we call the local content. And most of the money comes, it goes to a Chinese company, and that's why I want to caution now the Ugandans, so that we partake, if this money ever comes, we need to partake some of these benefits, so that if $1 billion, let's say Karuma Dam, $1.7 billion, how many Ugandans have even got $10,000 out of this? And of course the problem was not from the Chinese. The problem really was not from the Chinese. The problem is that we have a problem of scrutinizing. Also, let's not actually blame others without blaming ourselves. You must scrutinize these promises. If I have Karuma Dam $1.7 billion, they needed to say, how much money am I getting from this? How can you construct Karuma Dam $1.7 billion and our dollar rate continues now from 1,200 to now 3,800? What has happened there? And yet the money has purportedly come in the country. So we need to realize that when we get these promises, how are you positioning yourself to partake of these economic benefits? And this has not been forthcoming.
But there's an embarrassing reality when you look at 1.2 billion people with their 53 heads of state going to Beijing to ask for $60 billion. This is money that is owned by just a single individual in the United States who is just involved in the information economy like Mark Zuckerberg.
More than that, actually.
More than that.
Amazon is now $1 trillion.
What do you make of that?
Of course, I must tell you that being an African for sure can be very frustrating. And why I told you the two cardinal rules of natural capital. Natural capital, we've got tourist potential. But then we're fighting. So how will they come? Then human potential. Most of our people, when they leave here, they don't come back. And it's not because they don't want to come back, but sometimes we don't create the conditions for them to come back.
Let me tell you, I'm one of those who paid money to get out of the United States.
Exactly.
To New York, to be exact, because I could not stand the cold.
then that
I
makes
paid
two
to
of
leave.
us. I was in England, and I came back here 12 years ago with a lot of energy, having understood very well how Europe developed and all that. And I came with a lot of energy, thinking that by now Africa would have transformed. So I've told you that it's very frustrating to be an African. Most of the time, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So instead of discussing or even encouraging meritocracy and developing our human resource, I always laugh. You remember Libya, for example. It had the best military in Africa, and how the US military obliterated it in 1 hour. So nothing frustrates me like when I see Africans posturing that, oh, we have a military. And so why don't we transform our people? And here's the conundrum. China understood that power comes from economics. You can see that President Trump, despite his, somewhat obnoxious statements, is fighting back and saying, okay, if we don't look at our economics, the empire is going to collapse, not because it doesn't have the weapons and the guns. Economics and politics are intertwined. That's why the most famous book in economics is Political Economy. So if you're really to take this discussion seriously, and the question you asked him about whether we are pawns, sometimes we are. And here's the most dangerous thing about the debt, why I always talk about capital markets. See, when you borrow in US dollars, and you don't have the capacity to create US dollars as fast as you should, either due to weak exports, you realize that this so-called interest rate of 2% is actually not 2%, because it becomes a lot. In fact, when you go to a bank to borrow US dollars, they ask you, do you have US dollar income? Because they are aware that if the exchange rate moves against you. So for me, Africa, the biggest risk in all this, we can collapse ourselves, because do we have it? Do we earn enough dollars?
We don't.
So now, what if now the dollar is at, it was 1,600
Now
10 years ago when I
800.
came back. It's now 4,000. So if you had borrowed $1 million, and let's say up to now you haven't paid the principal, do you realize
the
that
value
you
now?
have 4 times the shillings that you borrowed?
Okay,
and how are you creating?
Dr. Fred Mohammed, I want you to take us into the tourism potential that we have, and not the traditional tourism of where you get Mzungu, a Caucasian person comes and then looking with the binoculars and the khaki trousers and maybe a hat and going into the savannah. There's a new trend, because look at cities like New York. You have the New York Marathon, you have the New York Open, you have the New York Fashion Week, and people are going into that city and making money. Ugandans, we have started to do our own things. You have wines and blankets. It is now getting a regional repute. You have the Nyege Nyege thing that has even bringing people from across Africa and beyond. You have the Mpako Festival in Toro. But it looks like when those things are taking root, now you see what the minister comes up with, that don't do it. And yet, I'm told now you could not even get a hotel room in Jinja by yesterday because all people have come from all over the world and they are there. And they're going to leave money in that economy. And so there was the Karamoja sort of cultural, festival. These are the things that we need to start doing, intra-trade, develop our own resources, and maybe that could save us at the end of the day.
I think you're actually speaking to the real heart of our problem. As I said, if you do not have a strategy of how do I want to grow my country, you won't even know what skills to develop. You have no idea what pain everyone goes through that we have no tourism institute, which is supposed to be in the same Jinja you're talking about. Now, all these people are going to begin hiring Kenyans to actually come and look after these tourists. So part of the money the guys are bringing into Uganda is going to go back to our friends in Kenya, because we have had to hire these people to come and look after these guests. So if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, and people are literally scratching to build something. When you go and see Mount Fuji in Japan, and you are familiar with our mountains here, you will literally be saying, where is Mount Fuji? I haven't seen it. But they have made it a global icon that they get lots of tourists who go there. So in Uganda, we think tourism is just about the lions, the hyenas, and a few other things. And yet we really need to look back and say, what else can we sell? And there are so many things that we could put out there and get people in here. Now I see there is going to be a rally in Hoima over the weekend. But somebody took advantage and said, hey, why don't we begin with the vintage cars? So my small town of Hoima is now also flooded with people from Kampala who have taken money there.
In fact, this weekend there's a party all over Uganda.
Exactly.
You start it from Karamoja, you have it in Jinja,
so
you have it in Hoima,
so you hear the US
Saturday,
Open.
You have the Toro coronation in Mpango in Fort Portal.
Exactly.
So you can see how
you hear Wimbledon, it's tennis, everybody comes and gathers there, and it's as if the whole world is watching that tennis. So every continent has a sports of tennis, except in Africa. And why can't one country in Africa also put an Africa Open or something?
Champions
so that
League.
the whole world comes and
but as we
gathers
do that, because
That's
of
the
our
strategy.
governance issues and our problem that we have, today, the Honorable Robert Chagulanyi got prime time on international television, CNN and Al Jazeera and BBC, still talking about the problem that we have. So when we try to do something, we still have a problem that may not attract people with big money.
That's why I said because
you have issues.
You have a governance issue. Today, I think yesterday is when Parliament withdrew, talking about political economy. It's about protecting people, distribution of resources, managing these resources, and protecting assets of the people. Because I'm not going to invest to come here and invest in Serena Hotel if I'm not sure it will still be mine 5 years from now.
After some time.
Now, look at what we are discussing in Parliament. How to grab people's land without compensation. Now, you expect an investor to come here and put a hotel when he's not very sure that government next year may come and say, but this piece of land, I want it for a public interest. Which interest now the law has been changed. You want to give people, that's why the people who designed this system say, you can have a 49-year lease. Actually, it can even be 99 years. Because everybody is like, in 49 years, in 99 years, I would have recovered my money. Now, we are moving all that certainty that you can get a title of 99 years, but we have just passed a law that should the cabinet sit and dream and say, by the way, we wanted that land, they can take it as they wish. Which investor is going to come here and put $30 million?
Let me open, gentlemen, allow me, let me open the lines so at least we can have 2 or 3 people make their contributions, and we get to know what Ugandans are thinking about this Chinese charm offensive to Africa. I'll be taking the first caller online. And remember, like I always say, when you are calling, please, hello?
This is Bayo calling from Zambia.
In Zambia, you're on air, sir.
Oh, I appreciate the panel.
You're welcome.
But my biggest question, I think, Uganda has to answer is a governance issue. We have got a government which is too interested in rewarding, most especially political failures, and they have done nothing other than uprooting Uganda. For example, if you were, let's say, give a minister from Port Portal or from Kawarara district and giving them like 3 markets, which one can benefit the Rwenzori region? a minister or free market. So if we have a government that is interested in doing such things, then they want to enter the state.
Unfortunately, even our people, when they see the head of state, they're asking for reward us with the ministry, reward us with the district or something like that.
But you don't take people where they want to be. You take them where they ought to be.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yes, because now the second point is we have our government officials who have traveled. I have had all the good things abroad. I believe almost every permanent secretary has traveled around the world. Our dear president has traveled, and you, the media, you have traveled. Really, people come and take our good policies, they go and make their countries happy. What is failing us? Why don't we be Ugandans in spirit, not just in physical appearance in and around Uganda? Because the brains are around. Thank you, Mr. Kamal.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your insights on the matter. And yeah, well, let me take another call online.
Thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Yes, good evening, sir. What's your name and where are you calling from?
This is Francis. I'm calling from Chalojala.
You're on air, Francis.
Yeah, Patrick, I just have one comment.
Yes.
There will be absolutely no solution without a political solution.
Could you elucidate more on that?
Yeah, I'm just simply saying,
yes,
all issues only be resolved once we have a political solution. Once we can't organize very nicely, politically, I do not expect any other issues to come into play. So we need to first organize ourselves politically, and then the others will come into place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The issues of governance and leadership.
Yep.
Okay. Let me take maybe 2 more calls, and then my guest.
Hello.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, good evening, sir. How are you?
What's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm called Soraya, calling from Chileka.
You're on air, sir.
Yes, I think the problem is that these people who rule us completely failed to direct our conflict in Africa. And those Chinese realized their problem and their country, and they have got a lot of money to spend in Africa. There was one time when there was a debate on Africa in Sierra Leone. So they were calling it land grabbing in Africa. They were like, is it land grabbing in Africa? Which China is coming with its development? And I think, as Africans, we are losing it for. Those Chinese are just new guys on the block, just coming to colonize Africa with newly. Because, for example, you count all the projects around here. They just give us money, they come and take the same money back. For example, the investment in Karuma, how much are we reaping? Where that money is going?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to take just one more caller. If you can make it precise and concise, and then my guests will make concluding remarks. I have a caller online. Hello. Hello. Okay.
Hello?
Yes, good evening, sir. What's your name and where are you calling from? Can you make it precise and concise?
Yeah, my name is Derek. I'm calling in from Kitende.
Okay, Kitende is on air tonight.
Yeah, Kitende is okay. Thank you. I'd like to make a short comment. One thing I've realized, Patrick, is that aid-giving countries have been using it as a means of promoting and protecting their own interests, including actually political ones. They have been trying to impose highly stringent conditions on the aid-receiving countries. Actually, they have also, like, they try as much as possible to impose stringent monetary and physical policies. This actually causes inflationary pressures and external indebtedness. So my question is, why should a country that is already indebted
go ahead and ask for a loan from a country like China, don't you think that one of these days this country will actually become
more or less like a property of the Chinese?
Yes, I mean, don't think
But
definitely we're going to become a property of China.
There's a case, I think, in Sri Lanka where the Chinese have taken over
A
port.
port, yeah, they were taking over a port.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, where are our policymakers? This issue is spiraling out of control, and we need to.
And there's something almost similar in Venezuela. But thank you very much, sir. And thank you all of you. I understand my producer is telling me many of you want to contribute on this topic of China's charm offensive in Africa, but we have to stop the calls from there. I appreciate your insights on the matter, but I may be making concluding remarks, beginning with you, Dr. Fred Mhomoza.
I think my biggest remark is I agree that with the callers who agree with us, that it's not about what money we have or we don't have. It's a governance issue. We need to fix our politics. We should not be blaming the Chinese. We should not be blaming the World Bank. We should not be blaming the IMF. We should not be blaming anybody. We have only ourselves to blame. And what we are calling good policies are not necessarily good policies. Many times I scratch and I'm like, where are the policies in this country? Surely you are looking for standard gauge to fail what? And people are saying, it will shorten the journey. The journey for what? What are you taking to Mombasa? So it's shortening the journey for imports to come in? Is that what you want to be doing? So we really have to sort our house and put it in order if we are to engage the rest of the world.
Mr. Bakr Mayanja.
Yeah, we have to harness the two most important forms of capital, which is human capital, develop it further, and natural capital. And then, of course, we need to stop fighting with each other, and then we start doing business with each other. In order to do that, we must figure out Africa's infrastructure, both soft and hard. And I think one solution for me is one rail connecting the entire continent, which also has a fiber. And when we do business with each other and we care about each other and we visit each other, then that's how we are going to transform this continent. But that's not to say that getting capital from China is bad. No. It means that as Africa, we have to look at our competitive factors and develop them. And when we are getting this investment, we should negotiate well to get good terms and be wary of foreign debt, which means we need to develop our own markets. It's more important to fund 10 Ugandans with $100 each than to build these big things with foreign debt. Denominated in a currency which you don't have control over, you create a strategic risk for Africa that it may cease to exist because it can be taken over. So imperialism started with geographical capture. Now we need to be wary of economic capture, because I've always been saying that Africa celebrates independence for the last 50 years. But that's political independence. Where is economic independence? And do you think that the entire continent of Africa doesn't have enough brains and enough raw materials to get that economic independence? That should be the narrative. And like I said, because China, when it woke up, it had only 1 billion people. And now it's the second largest economy in the world in a space of 30 years. It means that Africa, for me, is potentially the second largest economy in the world, because we have 1.2 billion people and we have the biggest demographic dividend, labor, which will come at a cost, which will mean manufacturing is going to come to Africa. But it won't come when, instead of being friendly to each other, we are fighting each other. So those are my concluding remarks. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Professor Mwaga.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think my concluding remark is that what drives countries to transformation is really not politics, is economics. So economic power building is going to take over if Africa is not careful from politics. So I really urge African countries to focus on building our economic power. You build economic activity, you build business, you ensure that you have an environment in which you can create self-motive incentive, an environment in which you can command production, command the market, and that vote that you cast to realize that is actually cast in the market. So we should stop over romanticizing politics, but we should engage in business, and that's how China has. This century, Patrick, is called the Chinese century. The 21st century, for the information of Ugandans and other people who are listening to us, is called the 21st century. Why? Because really of the economic power of China when it captured the World Trade Organization, and is now the country in the world that takes the largest volume of commodities, both in quantum terms and also in monetary terms, and that's why everybody, when China now sneezes, everybody feels the party has catches the cold.
Thank you very much, Professor Duakaba. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayanja and Dr. Fred Muhumuza, and all of you who have been a part of this. In this China Charm Offensive, maybe if you can prepare yourself, because opportunities are for those who are prepared. But if we are not, then either we have to ride on the wave of change in economically, or that wave of change can bury us. But I think if we are organized, we can get something out of it. Good night, Uganda.